There is a number buried in Civil War records that most people never hear, and once you hear it, the rest of the war looks different. For a century, historians believe the war killed roughly 620,000 Americans. In 2011, new research pushed that number closer to 750,000. Scale that to today's population, and a war costing that proportion of American lives would kill nearly 7 million people in 4 years. And that is only where this story starts. What follows are 9 facts about the Civil War that rarely make it into any classroom, involving children, doctors, prisoners, and photographers. Facts almost too disturbing to summarize in a single sentence, every one of them documented in the letters and records the people who lived through it left behind. The first fact is the one that reframes everything else on this list, so it belongs first. More soldiers in the Civil War died from disease than from combat, and the ratio was not close. Roughly 2 out of every 2 deaths in this war came not from bullets or artillery, but from dysentery, typhoid, measles, and pneumonia, spreading through camps that had no functioning understanding of germ theory and no meaningful sanitation infrastructure. Men from rural areas who had never been exposed to childhood diseases common in cities arrived at training camps and contracted measles, mumps, and whooping cough in outbreaks that killed thousands before those soldiers ever fired a shot. Latrines were frequently dug too close to drinking water sources, and dysentery moved through entire regiments within days. Union and Confederate armies alike lost more men in a single winter of camp disease than many of their bloodiest battles combined. The war that Americans picture, full of cannon smoke and cavalry charges, killed fewer men than the war that never gets filmed at all, the one fought in mud, standing water, and unwashed hands. Camp Douglas in Chicago, used to house Confederate prisoners, saw a smallpox outbreak so severe that guards reportedly refused to enter certain sections of the camp, leaving prisoners to care for each other with almost no medical intervention at all. Union medical officers eventually calculated that a soldier was statistically safer standing in an active infantry line during a battle than he was spending a full winter in an average training camp. A statistic that sounds almost impossible until you account for how little anyone in 1861 understood about contaminated water and airborne contagion. The war in this sense was fought as much against invisible enemies as visible ones, and the invisible enemies won more often. Army physicians on both sides did attempt smallpox vaccination using whatever supply of vaccine matter they could obtain, but the vaccine itself was frequently contaminated or improperly stored, and outbreaks of what soldiers called vaccine disease, infections introduced by the vaccination process itself, added yet another layer of illness to camps already struggling with dysentery and typhoid. The well-intentioned effort to prevent one disease sometimes introduced another, which says something about how far 19th century medicine still had to go before it could reliably do more good than harm. The second fact concerns what happened to the men who survived being shot. Civil War surgery had no access to modern antiseptic practice, no understanding that microscopic organisms caused infection, and often no time to clean instruments between patients during the chaos following a major battle. Surgeons frequently used the same scalpel and the same unwashed hands on one wounded man after another, and the survival calculus for a soldier hit in the arm or leg came down almost entirely to speed. Amputation within the first 24 to 48 hours after a wound offered the best chance of survival, and field surgeons became capable of removing a limb in under 10 minutes. After major engagements like Gettysburg, witnesses described piles of amputated arms and legs stacked outside surgical tents, sometimes reaching the height of a man, because the volume of wounded arriving simply outpaced any system for disposing of what the surgeons removed. Roughly 3 out of every 4 surgical operations actually performed during the entire war turned out to be amputations, and the men who survived the operation still faced a substantial chance of dying afterward from the infections that followed. Infections doctors at the time did not yet understand how to prevent, because germ theory itself was still years away from acceptance in American medicine. Chloroform and ether were available and used far more often than popular imagination assumes. Contrary to the enduring myth of soldiers biting down on a leather strap or a bullet during operations, most amputations were performed with the patient anesthetized. The real danger was almost never the pain of the surgery itself. It was what happened in the days afterward, when infection set into a wound that had been touched by instruments carrying bacteria from the last 10 patients, in tents where flies moved freely between operating tables and the pile of removed limbs stacked outside. A soldier could survive the amputation itself, walk and talk normally for days afterward, and still die a week later from an infection that nobody in the tent had the scientific framework to recognize, let alone prevent or treat. The third fact is about a prison camp in southwest Georgia that became, for a period of 14 months, one of the deadliest places in North America. Camp Sumter, better known as Andersonville, was built to hold roughly 10,000 Confederate prisoners of war, and at its peak held more than 3 times that number, crammed into a stockade with no shelter, inadequate food, and a single contaminated stream serving as the entire camp's water supply and sewage system simultaneously. Nearly 13,000 Union prisoners died at Andersonville in just over a year, from starvation, disease, exposure, and a designated no-man's land near the stockade, known as the deadline, where guards had standing orders to shoot prisoners who crossed it, sometimes for stepping too close by accident. After the war, the commandant, Henry Wirz, was tried and executed, the only Confederate officer formally executed for war crimes committed during the conflict. What often surprises people is that Andersonville was not unique in its horror. Union-run prison camps, particularly one in Elmira, New York, that prisoners nicknamed Elmira, produced death rates that in some periods rivaled Andersonville's own. Roughly a quarter of the prisoners held at Elmira died there, in a northern state, under Union guards, in conditions that Union authorities were slower to reform than public memory of the war tends to acknowledge. Survivors of Andersonville who testified after the war described a black market economy that developed inside the stockade itself, where prisoners organized into gangs, some preying on fellow inmates for what little food or clothing they had left. A group of prisoners known afterward as the Andersonville Raiders became notorious enough for robbing and beating other captives that a separate group of prisoners, calling themselves the Regulators, organized a trial inside the camp and hanged 6 of the raiders themselves, with the tacit permission of Confederate guards who had lost any real ability to maintain order inside the overcrowded stockade. It remains one of the only documented instances of Civil War prisoners conducting a capital trial and execution entirely among themselves, inside a prison camp that had, in every practical sense, stopped functioning as anything resembling a controlled facility. Wirz's own trial after the war, held before a military commission in Washington, drew testimony from dozens of former prisoners, describing conditions inside the stockade in detail that shocked even a northern public already numb to years of war casualties. Wirz argued at trial that he had been given inadequate resources by a collapsing Confederate government to properly supply the camp, an argument with real historical merit given the state of Confederate logistics by 1864. But the commission convicted him regardless, and his execution in November 1865 remains to this day the only formal war crimes execution to result from the entire conflict. The fourth fact involves an event that Confederate leadership never seriously investigated and that Union authorities documented extensively through congressional testimony. In April 1864, Confederate forces under Nathan Bedford Forrest overran the Union garrison at Fort Pillow, Tennessee, roughly half of which was composed of black soldiers serving in the United States Colored Troops. Survivor testimony collected almost immediately afterward by a congressional committee described Confederate soldiers killing black Union soldiers after they had already surrendered or attempted to surrender, in numbers that made the fort's casualty rate among black troops dramatically higher than among white Union soldiers captured in the same engagement. Confederate reports at the time and lost cause historians afterward disputed the scale of what happened, but the surviving testimony from soldiers who were there, combined with the disproportionate casualty numbers, has led most modern historians to describe Fort Pillow as a massacre rather than a battle. The event became a rallying cry for Black Union soldiers for the remainder of the war, some of whom reportedly went into subsequent engagements shouting Fort Pillow's name rather than accepting surrender from Confederate forces who might not extend it to them. The psychological effect cut in both directions. Some Black Union regiments after Fort Pillow adopted an unofficial understanding that surrender to Confederate forces carried a real risk of execution rather than capture, which meant that engagements involving United States colored troops in the war's final year were sometimes fought with a level of desperation on both sides that battles between all-white units did not typically carry. Confederate authorities never conducted a formal court-martial related to Fort Pillow, and Forrest himself denied for the rest of his life that his men had done anything beyond the ordinary chaos of battle produced, a denial that the surviving congressional testimony collected from soldiers who were actually present that day directly and repeatedly contradicts. The fifth fact concerns how young some of the people fighting this war actually were. Both armies technically required soldiers to be at least 18 years old, but recruiters frequently looked past obvious lies about age, and boys as young as 12 or 13 served as drummers, buglers, and in some documented cases, as armed combat soldiers. John Clem, a Union drummer boy who ran away from home at age 9, became famous during the war after allegedly shooting a Confederate officer at the Battle of Chickamauga when he was 12 years old, and he was later formally enlisted into the Army by direct order after initially being turned away for being too young. Estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of boys under 18 served in some capacity across both armies, and some of the youngest documented soldiers were killed or wounded in combat before they had reached their teenage years. The war's demand for manpower was severe enough, particularly by 1864, that questions about a recruit's age were often treated as formalities rather than serious screening criteria. Girls, too, found ways into the war that recruitment records never officially acknowledged. At least a few hundred women are documented to have disguised themselves as men and served as soldiers on both sides, some undiscovered until they were wounded or killed and Army surgeons examined their bodies. Sarah Edmonds served in a Michigan infantry regiment under a male alias for roughly 2 years before deserting, not out of discovery, but reportedly to avoid a medical examination that would have exposed her. The war's manpower demands were desperate enough, and its verification systems primitive enough, that age and even gender turned out to be far more porous barriers to enlistment than either army's official regulations suggested on paper. The sixth fact is about what happened to soldiers who tried to leave. Desertion during the Civil War was a serious and widespread problem on both sides, driven by disease, hunger, and letters from families describing conditions at home that made staying in the ranks feel unbearable. Military law on both sides authorized execution as a punishment for desertion, and while pardons and lesser punishments were common, both the Union and Confederate armies carried out public executions of deserters throughout the war, sometimes forcing entire regiments to stand in formation and watch. Some of the men executed for desertion were teenagers who had enlisted under false age claims years earlier and simply could not endure what they had signed up for. The executions were deliberately public, staged in front of assembled troops specifically to deter further desertion, and first-hand accounts from soldiers who were forced to witness them describe a lasting psychological toll that in some cases outweighed the deterrent effect the executions were meant to produce. George Gordon Meade, commanding the Army of the Potomac, once ordered the mass execution of 5 deserters on a single day in 1863, forcing the entire corps to march in formation past the open graves before the men were shot, a spectacle designed to make the consequence of desertion as visually unforgettable as possible for every soldier who watched it. Soldiers' letters and diaries from the period describe these events with a discomfort that suggests the tactic often backfired, leaving witnesses more disturbed by their own army's willingness to kill its own men than deterred from ever considering desertion themselves. The seventh fact concerns what happened to soldiers after they died, which for a staggering number of men meant nothing at all in any formal sense. There was no organized system for identifying and recording Civil War dead when the war began, no dog tags, no uniform process for notifying families. After major battles, burial parties worked as quickly as possible in summer heat, often digging mass graves and burying men where they fell, with minimal or no identification. At Antietam, the single bloodiest day in American military history, some bodies remained unburied on the field for days after the fighting ended, in September heat, while photographers arrived to document scenes that had never before been captured so directly for an American public far from the battlefield. Historians estimate that roughly 40% of the Union dead and a considerably higher percentage of Confederate dead were never identified at all, buried as unknown soldiers in graves that in many cases remain unknown to this day. Families sometimes waited months or years for news that never definitively arrived, unsure whether a husband or son was dead, captured, or simply lost in the chaos of a war that had no reliable mechanism for tracking its own casualties. Clara Barton, who would go on to found the American Red Cross, became so troubled by the volume of families writing to her searching for missing sons and husbands that she established a formal missing soldiers office after the war, specifically to help trace what had happened to men the military itself had lost track of. Her office eventually identified the fate of roughly 20,000 missing soldiers, a genuinely significant achievement that nevertheless represented only a small fraction of the total number of men whose families never received any clear or final answer about how, where, or even whether their son or husband had actually died. The eighth fact is about what the war did to civilians who were never anywhere near a battlefield, and it is perhaps the most overlooked disturbing reality of the entire conflict. During the siege of Vicksburg in the summer of 1863, civilians trapped inside the city dug caves into the hillsides to escape near-constant Union artillery bombardment, living underground for weeks at a time as food supplies dwindled toward nothing. Vicksburg was not an isolated case of civilian suffering. Across the South, the combination of Union blockade, wartime inflation, and the collapse of agricultural labor produced food shortages severe enough to trigger bread riots in cities including Richmond, where hundreds of women broke into shops and warehouses in April 1863 to seize food they could no longer afford to buy. Civilians on both sides experienced a war that textbooks tend to describe almost entirely in terms of battles and generals, when, for a significant portion of the population who lived through it, the war's defining experience was hunger. In Richmond, the Confederate capital itself, food scarcity became so severe by 1863 that ordinary domestic staples reached prices that would have seemed like satire before the war. Families who had comfortably fed themselves on modest incomes in 1860 found themselves unable to afford flour, meat, or sugar at all by the war's midpoint, as Confederate currency lost the majority of its value and the naval blockade strangled imports that Southern agriculture, oriented for decades around cash crops rather than food production, could not adequately replace. The Vicksburg cave dwellers left behind letters and diaries describing artillery shells landing directly on the hillside shelters where families slept, killing civilians who had already given up nearly everything else, just trying to survive a siege that showed no sign of ending. One woman's surviving account from inside the besieged city described counting the days not by dates on a calendar, but by how many actual meals her family had managed to scrape together that week. A small, quiet detail that captures something true about the siege that casualty figures alone never could. Taken together, these 9 facts describe a conflict considerably darker than the version most Americans encounter in a classroom. The Civil War is remembered, appropriately, as the moment the country confronted the question of slavery in the only terms that question ultimately allowed. But it was also a war fought largely without antibiotics, without reliable food supply chains, without any agreed system for tracking its own dead, and, in the case of Fort Pillow and certain prison camps, without the basic protections that even 19th century warfare was supposed to guarantee. What makes these 9 facts worth sitting with is not simply their individual horror, but what they reveal collectively about the actual texture of the war, as opposed to the version that survives in monuments and textbook summaries. The soldiers who fought it were sometimes children, disguised women, or men who had lied about their age to recruiters who barely bothered to check. The doctors who treated the wounded were often working with tools and knowledge that, by modern standards, were barely a step removed from guesswork, and the survival of an amputated limb sometimes came down to luck as much as skill. The prisoners held on both sides faced conditions that, in the worst camps, amounted to a slow-motion death sentence regardless of which uniform their captors wore. And the civilians caught in the war's path, in Vicksburg, in Richmond, in dozens of towns and cities across the South, were reduced at times to conditions that would have been genuinely unthinkable to them in 1860, when the war was still an abstraction discussed in newspapers rather than a daily struggle to find enough food to survive the week. None of this diminishes what the war ultimately accomplished, and it would be a mistake to read it that way. The abolition of slavery in the United States was worth an enormous and terrible cost, and the country that emerged from the war, however imperfectly and however slowly, was a genuinely different and in crucial ways a far better country than the one that had existed before it. But understanding what that cost actually looked like, the disease, the amputations, the prison camps, the massacred prisoners, the child soldiers, the executed deserters, the unidentified dead, the staged photographs, and the starving civilians, gives the achievement a weight that the sanitized version of this history, the one built around famous speeches and decisive battles, tends to leave out entirely. The real Civil War was not just fought, it was survived by ordinary people who endured things that most modern Americans, looking back from a much safer distance and a much healthier century, can barely imagine having to face themselves day after day for 4 consecutive years.